I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Mary Lintern, and I'm from the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. I, along with my colleague, Debbie Weinkamer, will be presenting the program today, Murder Most Foul. So you're going to get 2 stories for the price of 1. Now, the stories have nothing to do with our 20th president, except they do involve famous people and a shocking murder. Okay? Just like James Garfield. These stories also involve an architect, that's the famous person, a mistress, and a madman. And we're going to begin with my story, Murder at Madison Square. And here are the characters. If you've never heard of Stanford White, Evelyn Nesbit, and Harry K. Thaw, then you're probably not familiar with their love triangle that resulted in what was called the trial of the century and the crime of the century, long before we had the O.J. Simpson or the Lindbergh kidnapping cases. So our story takes place at turn-of-the-century Manhattan, which was called the City of the New Century. And at this time, it was undergoing an incredible transformation. So immigrants, or people had migrated to the city, increasing the population to 4 million, skyscrapers reaching to the heavens. At this time, too, you see automobiles on the streets with more frequency. And the theater also experienced a burst of popularity at that time. The theater district expanded up Broadway from Madison Square to Longacre Square. And just around the corner, there were upscale merchants like Tiffany. And further north, you had the mansions of the super wealthy, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Whitneys. And at the center of that transformation is Stanford White from the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White. So his jewels, including those mansions I just mentioned, as well as the Admiral Farragut Memorial, St. Paul's Church, Pennsylvania Station, the New York Herald Building, and the Tiffany Building. Stanford White also remodeled the White House for Theodore Roosevelt. Now, he was born in New York City in 1853, and he's a larger-than-life character. He was described as a visionary and a genius. He sometimes had 60 projects going at once, so he is what we'd say today, the world's most interesting man. He's an art connoisseur, he's an avid theater goer, he's a patron of the finest restaurants. He's 6 feet tall, he has bright red hair, this bristling mustache, so he's a standout in any crowd. And everyone liked Stanford White. Everyone except Harry Thaw, and no one liked him. Whereas Stanford White was described as a genius, Harry Thaw was described as not quite an imbecile. He's born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1871, and he is heir to a $40 million coal and railroad fortune. He stood an imposing 6 feet 2. But he had that doughy face of an infant. And he is the poster child for a mama's boy. Harry grew up spoiled and petted by his adoring mother. As a child, he's prone to tantrums and fits and episodes of great excitement. Harry was also subject to bouts of incoherent babbling and baby talk. And this would be a nauseating form of expression that he would carry through his adult years. The misfortunes of others brought fits of giggling to him. Harry used his status to gain entry into Harvard University, but was ultimately expelled for immoral practices, as well as for intimidating and threatening fellow students and teachers. Upon his expulsion, his father decreased his monthly allowance to $2,500. When Harry's father died in 1893, that's a lot of money then, his mother upped his allowance to $8,000 a month, and he inherited $3 million. Over the years, he would get the nickname Mad Harry. He would spend his fortune recklessly. He'd go on multiple trips to Europe. One time he hosted an extravagant dinner party for Parisian beauties, and he gave them all jewelry wrapped around their cocktail glasses. And the bill for this extravagant dinner was $50,000. He would light cigars with $100 bills, so he's that kind of guy. One time he rode a horse into a New York club that denied his membership. In Harry's mind, Stanford White was the reason he was omitted in high society Manhattan. Harry was obsessed with Stanford White long before he became obsessed with Evelyn Nesbit. Florence Evelyn Nesbit is also from Pittsburgh, born in either 1894 or 1895. She was never quite sure, as her mother often lied about her age. She's called Evelyn, which is also her mother's name. So just to make the story less confusing, I'm going to refer to her mother as either Mother or Mrs. Nesbit. Now, Evelyn's early years were right out of a Dickens novel. As a young girl, she and her younger brother Howard enjoyed many privileges of a middle-class upbringing. So they went to school, they had the piano lessons, they had the picnics and the baseball games. But everything changed when Evelyn's father died. She was only 10 years old. Her father was an attorney, so he was able to afford a nice middle-class living. But after he died, they were penniless. And the family is evicted from their home. The Nesbits would shuffle from ramshackled houses to relatives' homes. They just never had a place of their own after that. One day, when Evelyn was either 13 or 14 years old, a female artist who lived locally discovers her, and she changes Evelyn's life. So she saw Evelyn peering into a store window, and she thought she had discovered the greatest beauty. She would pay Evelyn to sit for hours for her in her studio. And eventually, other artists would pay this beguiling teenager to sit for them. As Evelyn becomes more and more popular as an artist model, Mrs. Nesbit decides she must take her family to New York, where her daughter could earn some real money. And now we're in Manhattan in the year 1900. Stanford White's crowning achievement was Madison Square Garden, which is a huge exposition and entertainment complex with a concert hall, rooftop theater, surmounted by a Spanish Renaissance tower, which contained offices, studios, and apartments. And it soared 32 stories high, which was the city's second tallest building at the time. At the very top of the tower was a statue designed by White's good friend, Auguste Saint Gaudens. Diana, goddess of chastity, was the first nude statue by the artist. White was known for having relationships with younger girls, younger chorus girls in the tower apartments, and also in various places around town, which he called his snuggeries. So you know the term love nest? And also the phrase, come up and see my etchings? Those are all attributed to Stanford White. So this statue is going to cause quite a scandal. Many people would avert their eyes when they went past the building and cast their eyes away or cover their eyes in embarrassment. White received the wrath of this fellow here, Anthony Comstock. Anthony Comstock was a self-appointed moral guardian of Manhattan and the president for the Society of the Suppression of Vice. And by the way, Harry K. Thaw, he secretly funded Anthony Comstock's club. Now, Comstock, I want to stay here for a moment. Comstock insisted that White cover up the nude statue. Wright, so angry at the censorship, ordered lights be installed under the statue. So you can see these are actual photographs of Diana. She's no longer there. And you can see in the second photograph, no lights. In the third photograph, you can see the floodlights. So this is the world Florence Evelyn Nesbit finds herself. The name Evelyn Nesbit doesn't mean much today, but everyone knew who she was at that time. And here's a wonderful quote that was written about her. She was the most exquisitely lovely human being I ever looked at. She had the slim, quick grace of a fawn, a head that sat on top of a flawless throat as a lily on its stem, eyes that were the color of blue-brown pansies and the size of $50, a mouth made of rumpled rose petals. After arriving in New York at the age of 15 or 16, she becomes an overnight sensation as a model. Newspapers picked up on it right away and said that she came with nothing but her looks and that her face was worth a fortune. And if you just go Google her name, you will find endless images of her. She could be whatever you wanted her to be. She could look innocent, exotic, seductive. She could be a woman, a child. And this was when fashion photography was really becoming an advertising medium and in print. So she is what people describe the first supermodel. And here's a few more of her poses. She also posed for all the top artists at the time. So she went from artist model to cover girl, becoming the most popular face on all the popular magazines at that time. And inside those magazines, you see her face advertising face creams, toothpaste, range of other consumer goods. Here we have Evelyn as the inspiration for Whitman's chocolates, and also the inspiration for Anne of Green Gables. Not the story, but the illustration on the cover. Evelyn decided at age 16 that she wanted to go into the theater. Of course, that's the next natural step. The most popular show at the time was Florodora. She convinces her mother to let her try out, and of course they lie about her age. Evelyn was in the chorus. She wasn't one of the sextet, but she's so stunning that she really stood out among the other beauties. Stanford White saw the show over 40 times. So Stanford White gets one of the chorus girls to ask Evelyn to join him for lunch at his apartment. Ironically, his snuggery was in the FAO Schwartz toy store. Now his apartment was filled with fine art, statuary, and antique furniture. It was really elaborate. And Evelyn enters this incredible world of luxury, and she was there at that time with the other chorus girl. It seemed innocent enough. Stanford White allowed Evelyn to drink a glass of champagne, and they feasted on a sumptuous meal from the famous Delmonico's. It was in the apartment that Stanford White would introduce Evelyn to the red velvet swing. So in one of the upper rooms, he had this huge swing suspended from the ceiling, red velvet, that he would have the chorus girls swing on. And then there was a paper, I don't get it either, a paper umbrella, and he would have them to swing as high as you can and try to pierce the umbrella with the tip of your shoe. After that day, Stanford White became this benevolent father figure to Evelyn and her family. He sends Evelyn to his personal dentist to correct a discolored tooth, thus making her perfect. He moves the family into a personally designed suite at the Wellington Hotel and gives Mother Nesbit a weekly allowance. He brings Evelyn to elegant parties at Madison Square apartment, where she mingled with the elite of music, art, finance, and politics. I wonder what Evelyn talked about. Sometimes they would go to the top of the tower where she could reach up and touch the foot of Diana. And he buys Evelyn many gifts, furs, jewelry, and clothing. And here we see Evelyn in her new red cloak. Stanford White in this photograph, and at that time was 47 years old, and here we have 16-year-old Evelyn. And we'd like to make the comparison of the big bad wolf and, of course, Little Red Riding Hood. And in case you're wondering, yes, Stanford White is married. He and his wife spent most of their time in White's Long Island estate. Now, Evelyn continues to model during the daytime and acting at night. So let's talk about Evelyn's mother. Remember, of course, her daughter is very young. She's underage. And although the mother Nesbit was completely unprepared to make a living when she became a widow, she's using her daughter. You could say that both Evelyn and Harry's mother had very monstrous behavior. Mother Nesbit said that her daughter never posed nude, which is wrong. She chose to turn a blind eye because of the money. So Stanford White was easily able to convince Mother Nesbit to take an excursion to Pittsburgh to visit her family. The day she left, Stanford took Evelyn to the office of McKim, Mead, and White, and he introduces her to McKim. And he tells his colleague that he's been given charge of this young lady. And McKim responds, "Oh my God." The next day, Stanny told Evelyn, "We are going to have a fun day of modeling." He had her try on numerous outfits that he bought, including this kimono that you see in this photograph. By the way, this photograph was the last photograph in a long session, and she was truly tired and laid down on the bearskin rug, as the story goes. And the kimono she's wearing is a $2,000 kimono. And this would have been on a penny postcard. It was titled Little Butterfly. It's very famous, probably the most famous photograph of her. So White tells Evelyn, "You don't need to pose for those old stiffs anymore. I'm going to introduce you to some real artists." One of them was Charles Dana Gibson, the creator of the Gibson Girl. And this is a very popular image of Evelyn also, the eternal question. White also takes Evelyn to Gertrude Casper. This is another iconic image of Evelyn, probably the, again, top 3 photographs of her. It's titled Miss N. And this photograph really reflects the dichotomy of the Gilded Age. Here we have something very innocent with the possibility of something forbidden. Evelyn represents a girl with her hair down, yet a woman with her hair up. She's has that seductive, direct gaze. She's wearing this mythological costume. So again, a very, very popular image of her. The following day, Stanford invites Evelyn to a party at his apartment. And when she shows up, no one is there. On this occasion, Stanley allows Evelyn to drink multiple glasses of champagne. Remember, in the past, he only allowed her to have one drink or a few sips. After a while, Stanley led the intoxicated teenager up a narrow staircase to his secret studio. Evelyn is escorted into a 10 by 10 foot room wallpapered in dark purple chintz and illuminated subtly by indirect colored lights. The room also contained a 4-poster canopy bed surrounded by curtains. This is Evelyn's description, by the way. The headboard, as well as the dome of the canopy and the wall next to the bed, were 3 solid beveled mirrors. Later, Evelyn would claim to remember nothing of the night due to the large consumption of alcohol. She said she passed out, and when she awoke, she found herself naked and the architect naked asleep next to her. From that day on, Evelyn is Stanford's mistress. She described him as a force of nature, like an earthquake. His nickname for her was Kittens. They continued to have a discreet love affair. Stanford also continued to support her family, and he also helped her career, introducing her to some of the top managers on Broadway. In 1902, Evelyn lands a feature role in a new play, The Wild Rose, in which she plays the gypsy girl Vashti. Now what's interesting is this contract, and you probably can't read all of it then, but it's so great. Evelyn is not allowed to become engaged while under contract. She's not allowed to be seen walking on the streets with men or even with a dog, or be seen carrying a dog. Not allowed to have images sold of her. Oh, if she appears apart, she has to have a face veiling, no stimulants of any kind, including coffee and tea. It's rather quite comical. Despite Evelyn's charms, Stanley still has a roving eye. And he continued to look for newer and younger prizes. He buys other girls gifts and sends them flowers. Of course, this does not please Evelyn, and she wants to make him jealous. So she begins a romance with Jack Barrymore from the famed Barrymore acting family. But Jack was not in theater. He was a struggling artist. Now, Evelyn happened to meet Jack at one of Stanley's parties, and she gave him her phone number and he wrote it on his cup. And they would have a month-long frolic that was gossiped about in all the papers. So I don't know how that wasn't breaking her contract. But this news infuriated Mrs. Nesbit. Infuriated Mrs. Nesbit. Jack had no money. Stanford White was rich. But you know, Stanford White wasn't jealous at all. In fact, he was relieved. He was happy because he was beginning to think he made a mistake with this girl. Evelyn had fallen in love with him, and that was dangerous. So now he wants to pass her off. Now, Evelyn never stayed out all night while under her mother's watch, but one fateful evening with Jack, she does. And the story is, once again, had a little too much wine, and they were dancing all night, and they fell asleep at Jack's apartment. When they returned to Evelyn's home the next day, who was standing there next to Evelyn's mother but Stanford White himself? And Mrs. Nesbit had called him because she was frantic. Mrs. Nesbit and Stanford decide to send Evelyn off to an all-girl private school in New Jersey. New Jersey. She had to leave acting, modeling, and the gay white way. Meanwhile, Evelyn still continued to get lots of fan mail. Sheet music is made for her. And there's one correspondent, a Mr. Monroe, who sent her tons of flowers, letters, silk stockings, and even cash. Evelyn was said to have sent them all away. Maybe to have one last fling, or maybe in defiance of her mother, she does agree to meet the persistent Mr. Monroe at Rector's Theater Restaurant. Another chorus girl, under Mr. Monroe's insistence, arranged the tryst. So Evelyn arrives at the restaurant. She takes a seat at an empty table and waits for her mystery man. Soon a man walks into the restaurant and falls to his knees. He kisses the hem of Evelyn's dress. "Do you know you are the prettiest girl in New York?" Of course she did. The man stood up to proceed to ramble on, and Evelyn sat stunned in silence. He warned her to stay away from White. In between these incoherent, excited monologues, the very peculiar man reveals his true identity. "I am Harry K. Thaw of Pittsburgh." Put off by this encounter of the strange man, Evelyn rejects any further advances by him and leaves the restaurant. And soon afterward, Evelyn is indeed sent away to boarding school. Mad Harry continues to court her obsessively and even goes to visit her in New Jersey. He's not giving up. And after a while, Evelyn started to soften to him. He, they said, had the faculty, when required, to impress upon others that he was truly a gentle, caring soul. He would ask her over and over again to marry him, and she would reject those proposals. In late 1902, while at school, Evelyn suffers an attack of appendicitis, and Mother Nesbit tries to contact Stanford White, but he's out of town. Out of desperation, Mrs. Nesbit calls Harry. Harry brought his personal surgeon to perform the surgery right in one of the classrooms. And this is going to ingratiate Harry to the family. Harry will then convince Mrs. Nesbit that she and Evelyn should join him on a trip so that Evelyn could recuperate. They should go overseas, set sail for Europe, and that's what they do in the spring of 1903. Despite promising this trip would be an aid to Evelyn's recovery, Harry planned the most ambitious itinerary he could think of, and the goal was to exhaust Mrs. Nesbit. In London and in Paris, they visited numerous museums and landmarks. Sometimes they changed hotel rooms several times a day. Before long, the tension between Harry and Mrs. Nesbit, it just grows to a bursting point. So Mrs. Nesbit returns to the States without her daughter. And by the way, Stanford White pays for Mrs. Nesbit's passage back to America. All the while, Harry is pressing Evelyn to marry him. One night in the Paris Ritz Hotel, Evelyn made the biggest mistake of her life and finally told Harry why she couldn't marry him. She told him of her seduction and ruination by Stanford White. They stayed up all night as Harry demanded she confess all the details, and the whole time he's slobbering and he's crying and he's falling to the ground. This is the greatest hurt he's ever experienced. The couple continues their tour of the continent, visiting Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. In Germany, Harry rents the entire Schloss Katzenstein Castle for a 3-week stay. Evelyn's just so happy they're going to be at one place for a long period of time. But this is where the biggest nightmare of her life comes in. One petrifying evening, Harry burst into Evelyn's room, naked and in a fury. And he tore off Evelyn's nightgown and raped her and terrorized her with the dog whip, all the while demanding that she tell him more and more about Stanford White and defaming her for her sinfulness. By the way, he had given all the servants the night off that evening so they could not hear Evelyn's screams or cries. The next day, Harry pretended none of that happened. He acted like everything was just as normal as ever. He couldn't understand why Evelyn refused to leave her bedroom. So eventually they return back to the States, and Evelyn settles back into New York and tries to resume her modeling and acting career. Stanford White and others filled Evelyn in on Harry's sordid past. Evelyn did find morphine needles on the trip. Harry was indeed a drug addict. They also told her how he posed as a theatrical coach, Mr. Reed, and lured chorus girls into sleazy hotels where he would bind and whip them. On one occasion, he forced a young actress into a bathtub and poured scalding hot water on her, all the while in the guise of the protector of female virtue. There were also reports of Harry binding and whipping a young bellboy who stole coins from his room. Despite the warnings, Evelyn did not stay away from Harry. What did she know of love? In 1904, they take another trip to Europe, and there's no outrageous episodes. And on April 5th, 1905, they get married. It was a small private ceremony at the home of a pastor. Life as a millionaire's wife was not what Evelyn imagined. As the couple moved in with Thaw's tyrannical, strictly religious mother, who demanded Nesbit's career as a model and as an actress never be mentioned again. Well, shortly after they're married, this calendar came out, and crazy Mrs. Thaw went around town trying to grab up every copy she could. As the years went by, Harry, if you can believe it or not, becomes even more increasingly bizarre. He becomes agitated and even more controlling. He demands that Evelyn recall every detail of her relationship with the Beast. He's obsessed with Stanford White. He has Evelyn's dental work undone. So Evelyn, again, she's moved away from Stanford White. She's moved on. But Harry cannot let him go. He hires detectives to follow Stanford White and report his every move, which I don't get because they're in Pittsburgh now. And Stanford White's in New York. Harry buys a pistol and he practices shooting on the grounds of their Lyndhurst home. And then he announces to Evelyn, we're going to go on another tour of Europe. In June of 1906, the couple arrive in New York in preparation for a voyage overseas. Untrusting Harry hires detectives to follow his wife as she shops around New York. What he was doing, nobody knew. But on the evening of June 25th, Harry takes his wife to see a play at the Madison Square Garden Rooftop Theater. Now, Evelyn is surprised that Harry wants to visit an establishment owned by the Beast. So they, along with a couple other friends, go to this theater. Despite the hot, humid weather, Harry refuses to remove his thick overcoat. The party is escorted to rotten seats, as Harry called them. During the show, Evelyn notices Harry's getting more and more agitated, which really wasn't unlike him, but her agitation's going up too. She knows something is not right. Harry gets up, he starts moving around the tables. He's talking to a few other guests. He can barely sit down. At 11 p.m., there's a commotion. Why? Because Stanford White has entered the theater, and he takes his seat at his private front row table. Evelyn is immediately struck with fear and suggests that they leave. The party makes its way to the elevator to exit the building, and when Evelyn turns around, she sees that Harry has not followed. He is not behind her. The soloist on stage, backed by a dozen chorus girls, sing, "I Could Love a Million Girls," when Harry approaches Stanford White at his table. The architect makes a move to rise, and from 2 feet away, Thaw shoots him twice in the face. The third shot enters his shoulder, and White falls to the ground and brings the whole table down with him. "You ruined my life," Harry shouted out. Some people thought he said, "You ruined my wife." Either way. A stunned audience at first wonders if the scene was a part of the show, but then chaos breaks out. Thaw is apprehended immediately and taken to the elevator where his wife is waiting. Harry hands a policeman a bill and asks them to call Andrew Carnegie to tell him that he is in trouble. And Stanford White dies at the feet of his beloved statue of Diana. So that is the wonderful story of Stanford White, Evelyn Nesbit, and Harry K. Thaw. But just to wrap up, as I mentioned before, it was called not only the crime of the century at the time, but also the trial of the century. It had caused a huge media sensation. This is Harry Thaw in his jail cell, which was called the Tombs, and you can see he is given celebrity treatment. He has a white tablecloth, he has fine china, he even has a brass bed. Evelyn is forced to testify, and she has to publicly, once again, go over every detail of her life and her romance with Stanford White. And I say romance, we could use other words for that. So it's a huge embarrassment for a lot of people. First trial, where you have a sequestered jury, which I found very interesting. Harry Thaw, first trial was a hung jury. Second trial, he's found insane and he's taken to asylum. He escapes. There's a third trial. He's found sane and acquitted of murder. He will eventually die in 1947 at the age of 76. Now, again, he became, there were people, of course, that absolutely were on Harry's side, and you can see there was even sheet music made for him, Why don't they set him free? Another interesting thing, the word playboy comes into the popular vernacular because of Harry K. Thaw. So whereas a lot of people have forgotten these names today or this murder today, some things still stay with us. What happened to Evelyn? Well, in 1910, she gave birth to a boy, Russell. She said Russell Thaw. She said it was Harry's son. He said it was not. She had remarried a dancer. That did not last very long, that relationship. She would go on to own a tea shop at one time. She starred in many movies. Many of them were autobiographical. And she attempts suicide at least twice in her life. But the good news is that she lived a nice long life. I think those early tumultuous years, of course, were very hard on her, but eventually she found her peace as an artist, and she died in 1967. And her gravestone, I thought was interesting, just simply says, Mother. Okay, and now I'd like to introduce Debbie Weinkamer. She's the lead volunteer at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, and she has part 2, which is a completely different story. So as this was called the trial of the century, well, it was called the trial of the century until the next trial of the century, which was just a few years later. And again, it involves an architect, a mistress, and a madman.
Part 2, on this dark and gloomy day. While we were in fabulous New York City for the first murder story, we are going to go to the sedate, calm Midwest. We are going to go where it's very rural, where things don't happen like we heard about with Ranger Mary. We're going to Spring Green, Wisconsin. And the murder there was known as the slaughter in Spring Green. And here's our characters. Our architect is Frank Lloyd Wright, whom many of you I'm sure have heard of. The mistress is Mamah Borthwick Cheney, and the madman is Julian Carlson. Now I know that some of you have probably even visited Frank Lloyd Wright's works in Pennsylvania, here in Northeast Ohio, so he's very well known. But we're going to go back a little bit to learn a little bit about him. He was born just near Spring Green, Wisconsin, and these are 2 charming pictures of young Frank. He's in a very rural area near the Wisconsin River, and this area was originally settled by his maternal grandfather who emigrated from Wales. He was actually born Frank Lincoln Wright, and he was the first of 3 children to Anna Lloyd Jones, who was a teacher, and William Wright, who was a music teacher and an itinerant minister. So he was born in 1867, a little bit after our Stanford White. When she was pregnant, Anna declared that her child would grow up to build beautiful buildings. So she decorated his nursery with engravings of English cathedrals that were torn from periodicals to encourage her infant's ambition. And when he was just a young boy, she gave him a set of educational geometric blocks. They were called Frebel's gifts. So when he was 9 years old, he was fixated on these blocks, and he could take these different shapes and build 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional items. When his parents divorced in 1885, he changed his name from Frank Lincoln Wright to Frank Lloyd Wright to take some of his mother's family into consideration, because he never saw his father again. In 1889, Frank Lloyd Wright married Catherine Tobin, who was very much someone in the social scene. She was called Kitty and was 19 when they got married. He was 21. They purchased land in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, and he built a house for her as a wedding present. And here's a wonderful scene of Frank Lloyd Wright with his mother with the star over her head. Again, somewhat of a mama's boy. He was very attached to his mother. And then he has his sister and brother in the picture, as well as his wife right in the front center, holding their first child. By 1909, they had 6 children. So Kitty was naturally a very busy mother running a household, taking care of children, and Frank seemed to have everything a man could want. He was an ambitious architect with a successful career, a comfortable home, a loving wife and family. This was the house he built for Kitty as a wedding present. It was expanded in 1895, and a studio for his architecture firm was added in 1898. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright's early kind of work, the Prairie House, with a 5-room shingle-style home. Now, his children recalled that the first 10 years of the parents' marriage was very happy, but their father was not very involved. Our other couple is Edwin and Mamah Borthwick Cheney. Now, Edwin was an electrical engineer from Oak Park. She had gone to the University of Michigan and was a librarian. And they had 2 children, John and Martha. But Mamah was more of a modern woman. You would call her an early feminist. She had interests outside the home and not really satisfied with her life as a wife and mother. And she met Kitty, Frank Lloyd Wright's wife, at a social gathering, a club that was in town. And soon after, Mamah's husband commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to build the Cheney house in the same neighborhood of Oak Park. So the red star is the Wright studio and home, and the blue star is the property where the Cheney's house was going to be built. It was finished in 1904. By that time, Frank Lloyd Wright was known as a man about town, very flirtatious with all the ladies. And he took a liking to Mamah as he's working on the house and having intellectual discussions with her. He realizes that she's very vivacious and his artistic equal, and maybe she would be all for him, where Kitty was busy with all these children and household concerns. So soon they're seen taking rides in Frank Lloyd Wright's automobile all around town. Oak Park is just tittering on this story because it's shocking the local society. Kitty is sure that this attachment's going to fade. She refused to even consider giving him a divorce. In fact, she called Mamah a vamp. She blamed her for taking her husband away. He asked Kitty for divorce a number of times in 1908 and 1909, but she absolutely refuses. She has the image that Frank is going to return to the family and is going to pick up where they left off with this happy home and children everywhere. He has even a beautiful playroom as part of their home and fills it with toys for the children. But by 1909, he and Mamah decide that they're going to leave America and meet up in Europe. Frank is going to put together a portfolio of his many designs, and it's published in Germany. He left his family, basically abandoned them at age 42, the same age that his father abandoned them. Mamah is there. She's working on some other things. She says, I have been standing on the side of life, watching it float by. I want to swim in the river. I want to feel the current. So they settled in Fiesole, Italy, in basically a countryside villa. It's a suburb of Florence, Italy. And their close friends thought this was scandalous. How can they be so open about this relationship when they were both still married? They both had spouses and children back in America. The newspapers were criticizing Frank Lloyd Wright, who was pretty well known at that point, implying that he's going to be arrested for immorality. And of course, this scandal is going to affect his work back home and any possible commissions that he might get. But their stay in Italy, was it escaping, or was it, a chance for them to get together and know each other more? But this villa inspired Frank Lloyd Wright's future work. He decides, when he returns to America, that he needed to purchase some land near his mother's family's property in Spring Green, Wisconsin, but asked his mother to purchase the land for him so that it would be in her name and all the interactions would be in her name, and it wouldn't put a spotlight on Frank Lloyd Wright, would not attract attention. But that's where he decided he would build Taliesin, his countryside villa, for he and Mamah. Taliesin is shining brow in Welsh, and it's going to be built within the mountain, not on the mountaintop, but as part of the top of the mountain. And it looked very similar to the European villas that they saw in Italy. Low and wide and snug. And he placed windows so that sun went through every room, and he also designed the furniture. And of course, he had a studio and a workroom there. And Mamah began translating the works of a Swedish feminist in one of these rooms. You can see the interior with the furniture that was made by Frank Lloyd Wright that fit right into the setting. It was known as organic architecture because he used local materials and he made everything fit the rooms. So Mamah starts to work for Ellen Key, and she's a feminist who's written these books. She's Swedish though, so Mamah's going to be the interpreter. She's going to put these books all in English, and of course they're going to give her ideas and almost confirm what she's doing with Frank Lloyd Wright is the right thing as a feminist, right? This is the kind of thing she wants to read. It's going to support her role. So by 1911, this house is built. It's beautiful. Edwin Cheney wants a divorce from Mamah. He knows this is never going to return to her joining he and the children. So a divorce is granted, but he retains the custody of the children. And the two children are there with a cousin in the left picture. And this makes the news because, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright is very newsworthy. And Kitty still refused to divorce Frank at this point, but these two move into Taliesin. These soulmates become the news in the Chicago Tribune on Christmas Eve. They write about the love cottage that they now live in, the love bungalow, and the love castle. So it appears in various newspapers. They had several good years at Taliesin's. In 1914, Frank is working in Chicago on this wonderful, huge project called Midway Gardens. And it sounds very much like Stanford White's Entertainment Center there at Madison Square Garden. It's a European-style concert garden for outdoor and indoor year-round dining, drinking, entertainment. And it's almost 187 miles from Spring Green. So Frank is going back and forth by train, working on this project with his sons. He has two sons that are working along with him. At Taliesin, they hire a new maid, Gertrude, and her husband, Julian Carlson, who was from Barbados. And he was of West Indian descent. Originally a very pleasant man. He's seen in the upper right corner. He grew increasingly paranoid as he's working there. His wife seemed to do her job very well, but Julian is getting paranoid. And Gertrude finds him often sitting by windows with a butcher knife in his hand, just staring out the windows. So on August 15th of 1914, they give their notice because Gertrude says, this is not a very comfortable situation. We need to leave. He says that he's going to leave the employment of Frank Lloyd Wright and Mamah. But before he left, he plotted to kill the residents of Taliesin, targeting the noon hour when workers and Mamah and her visiting children would be on opposite sides of the property waiting for their lunch. He bolted the private dining doors and windows. He attacked Mamah and the children with a shingle axe. That's in the middle top picture. Mamah was killed by a single blow to the face. Son John was slaughtered while he sat in his chair at the dining room table, his skull split in two. Daughter Martha managed to flee and run outside, but she was hunted down and slain in the courtyard. He coated their bodies with gasoline and lit them on fire and set some of the house on fire as well. Then he turned his attention to the workmen. Frank Lloyd Wright was somewhat like Thomas Jefferson. He always had workmen around him improving his property, improving Taliesin. So he had draftsmen and workers who were having their lunch, poured gasoline underneath the door, setting it on fire. And he waited outside as the one window that wasn't locked was the escape route of all the draftsmen and workers who were in that wing of the house. And as he butchered them, as they tried to escape, the fire almost consumed the residential wing of the house. 7 people were murdered, including Mamah and her 2 children, who were 11 and 9 years old. The draftsmen and several workers were killed. 2 who managed to climb out the window were attacked and injured, but not killed. Carlton waited outside, but then ran into the basement and hid in the furnace room. He attempted suicide by swallowing hydrochloric acid and hid there. And as the neighbors discovered the fire, they're running towards the property. They're trying to help anyone who they could. They're looking for the madman who did all this. And they decide they want to lynch him right there on the spot. But the police arrive and take him off to jail, the acid badly burning his esophagus, where he couldn't eat for the next few days. The newspapers start carrying the news. The Ogden Standard in Utah reported that some neighbors pointed to the tragic ruin of the kingdom of love as the strongest argument that the avenging angel still flies. In other words, this was karma for this illicit affair that was not part of the local standards. Frank Lloyd Wright gets word in Chicago that this horrible massacre has occurred at his home and takes the train that is the soonest one he can catch. And who is on the train with him? Edwin Cheney, Mamah's ex-husband, who's gotten the word as well. And they ride the same train to Spring Green. Cheney takes his children's commingled remains back to Chicago in a small wooden box. It's news everywhere. It's called the summer day that changed the world. Frank Lloyd Wright's own carpenters fashioned a simple box coffin for Mamah. There was no formal funeral. Her coffin was taken on a floral-laden farm wagon that was pulled by horses out to the Wright-Jones family cemetery nearby. Frank Lloyd Wright was desolate. He said, "I wanted to fill the grave myself." Gertrude was released from police custody shortly after she gave her testimony and went to Chicago with $7 in her pocket, and she was never heard from again. Her husband was indicted on August 16th and charged with murder of Mamah, the only death that was directly witnessed by a survivor. So that was the only one they could charge him with. He entered a not guilty plea, made 2 court appearances, but never stood trial because he died from starvation 7 weeks after the attack, despite medical attention that was trying to help him. The motive was never explained. No evidence of rational intention, including a conspiracy, has ever come to light, even to date. There have been a number of modern detectives who have gone back and researched this story and all the evidence, and they have no idea why Julian suddenly turned into this madman. After the fire, Frank Lloyd Wright rebuilt his Taliesin And believe it or not, there was another fire there in 1925 when the electrical wiring caught fire in one part of the house. So he had to rebuild that section a third time. So this is the overview of Taliesin in Wisconsin. It's now called Taliesin 3. And Frank Lloyd Wright threw himself into the work of refurbishing this home and taking new commissions. He said there's a release from anguish in action by keeping busy. He lost himself in his work. And then in 1937, he builds Taliesin West in Scottsdale, Arizona. So he winters in Arizona and spends the rest of the year in Spring Green. Some of you may have visited one or the other place. They're both open for tours. In his lifetime of 91 years, Frank Lloyd Wright had 50 years or so 70 years as an architect, designing over 1,000 structures, built 532 of them. Several are still standing. The Guggenheim Museum at the bottom right in New York was his last project. And many of his buildings have been renovated. They tend to leak, and they have to redo windows and roofs and things. But can you imagine these buildings being built at a time when there were Victorian structures, like Lawnfield, if you've been to the Garfield house? This would have been just mind-blowing, modern type of architecture. And so he brought this new style into vogue. The Frank Lloyd Wright that we know never lost his charismatic, eccentric manner during all those 91 years. He has his flowing cape and his famous pork pie hat, had a cane. Some people thought he was a bohemian and that he was a hustler or a promoter, but others really thought he was very artistic and unpredictable, but that's what made his designs so fantastic. He married 3 times altogether, died at age 91. Oh, before we go on, do you know who the actress is in the bottom right? Anyone recognize her? Anne Baxter. Anne Baxter is Frank Lloyd Wright's granddaughter. She is the daughter of Catherine from his first marriage, his daughter Catherine. And she had wonderful roles in some famous movies. But I thought that was sort of an interesting little fact. The other thing you might know is that the inventor of Lincoln Logs is Frank Lloyd Wright's second son. And so the Lincoln name that was in Frank's name comes to play in these Lincoln Logs. So if you're interested in learning more details, there are 3 books. Some of you may have read Loving Frank, probably a good 10 years ago now, for your book club at the library. It was very popular reading, but there are 2 other books, a novel by T.C. Boyle, they're called The Women, and then Death in a Prairie House is the one that's a more modern investigative story about the circumstances surrounding the slaughter in Spring Green. Now, what makes us so interested in these true crime stories, right? Why are we here today? This fascination with good versus evil seems to have existed in human nature forever. It seems to give us a glimpse into the mind of these people who've committed maybe the most fundamental taboo in human nature, murder. We want to figure out what drove these people to commit this extreme act, what makes them tick, because we'd never do such a thing, or would we? We want that insight into the psychology of a killer so that we can partly protect our own homes and our families. So here we have our architects, our mistresses, and our madmen. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes?
No, I don't.
Yes, ma'am.